The air was thick with tension as the strange pulse of static filled every corner of the room, vibrating through the walls and rattling the windows. No one could comprehend what was happening. A voice, cold and unsettling, cut through the chaos. "They're already here." Time seemed to freeze for a moment, frozen in a heartbeat that felt like a century. For that fraction of a second, humanity held its breath. Then the air crackled again, and the first alien transmission echoed through every device on Earth, its incomprehensible garble slowly becoming clear. It wasn't just noise, it was a message. A message from somewhere far beyond. And it was not meant for just one, but for all. "We've been waiting for you." The protagonist, standing before the flickering screen, felt the weight of the words settle deep in their chest. Everything they knew, everything they trusted, seemed to fall apart. It was too much to understand, too much to bear. As the streets outside erupted into panic, the world became a fragmented nightmare. Something had shifted. Humanity would never be the same again. The truth was out. There was no turning back. The words echoed in the protagonist's mind long after the transmission had ended, a haunting reminder of the alien presence. "We've been waiting for you." They repeated it over and over, unable to shake the weight of those words. In the midst of the chaos, they searched for meaning. What could it possibly mean? Who were they? Why were they waiting for humanity? The protagonist felt the pull of the unknown, the urge to understand. But there were no answers. Only silence. The once stable world outside had crumbled in an instant. The streets were flooded with panic, the air thick with fear. Government officials scrambled, their voices crackling through emergency broadcasts, trying to maintain control. But it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no covering it up. With the world spinning into disarray, the protagonist's heart pounded. There was no going back. Something irreversible had begun. As the world grappled with the reality of the alien transmission, the protagonist wandered the streets in a daze, unsure of where to turn. The government's emergency measures felt hollow. The truth was undeniable. Aliens were here, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Conversations around them were frantic, filled with questions that had no answers. What did they want? Why now? Was it too late? Everywhere they looked, the signs of panic were visible. People in the streets clutching their phones, staring at the glowing news broadcasts, their faces a mirror of the protagonist's own disbelief. The weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just an isolated incident. The world was about to change forever. Humanity was on the brink of something they could not comprehend. The protagonist's mind raced as they processed everything that had just unfolded. They tried to make sense of the events, but it was impossible. The world they had known, the one they trusted, had fractured. There was no longer any certainty. People had already begun to pick sides, forming factions and alliances in a world where everything was suddenly up for grabs. In one fleeting moment, everything had been torn apart. There were no longer any answers, only questions. The protagonist knew that they couldn't stay in the city for much longer. The sense of unease was too overwhelming. Everything had changed, and they had to adapt. The unknown was closing in. The fight had just begun, but who were they fighting for, and what was at stake? The protagonist stumbled back into their apartment, their minds still whirling with the revelation that had just rocked the world. The alien transmission, the chaos in the streets. Nothing made sense. But one thing was certain, they had been chosen, whether they liked it or not. The voice, the words, were all directed at them. "We've been waiting for you." The protagonist sat down in front of their old desk, the surface cluttered with papers and reminders of a life that now felt distant. The familiar was gone, replaced by the weight of a terrifying new reality. The old world was dead, and the new one was only beginning. There was no escaping it. The truth had a price, and it was one the protagonist wasn't ready to pay. The chaos in the streets had become routine, but for the protagonist, something had shifted. They had begun to notice strange things, whispers among officials, urgent conversations behind closed doors, meetings that didn't add up. It wasn't just the alien invasion that was the threat. It was something far more insidious. As they dug deeper into the government's response, they uncovered disturbing evidence of collaboration. High-ranking officials had been meeting in secret with the aliens for years. The alien message wasn't just a call for contact. It was part of a plan. The world had been manipulated long before the transmission, and the government had known. A sense of betrayal washed over the protagonist. They had trusted these people, these institutions that were now revealed as complicit in a conspiracy. The realization that their entire reality had been orchestrated hit hard. Everything was a lie. The deeper the protagonist dug, the more disturbing the truths became. They sought out allies, hoping for answers, only to find that those they trusted were just as complicit as the government. One such ally, a former military officer, had quietly slipped into the shadows, whispering of covert operations and hidden agendas. The protagonist's heart sank as they discovered that their friend, someone they had known for years, was far more than they seemed. "You think I don't remember?" the ally hissed, revealing their true identity as an alien sleeper agent. The confrontation was brutal and shocking. The betrayal cut deep. The protagonist's mind reeled. How could they have been so blind? Everything they had believed in had been a lie, and their trust had been shattered. The enemy wasn't just the aliens. It was humanity itself, and the realization was unbearable. The weight of the betrayal settled over the protagonist like a suffocating cloud. Trust had been shattered, and now they were alone. The realization that the alien invasion was merely the next phase in a larger plan was too much to process. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about exposing the truth. The government had known the aliens would come, and they had allowed it to happen. But there was something more disturbing at play. Humanity had been manipulated for decades, controlled by powerful factions that had used both humans and aliens as pawns in their game. The protagonist felt a sense of urgency. They had to act before it was too late. Every second that passed brought the aliens closer. Every decision they made now carried the weight of the future. But the bigger question loomed: could they trust anyone anymore? The more the protagonist learned, the more the puzzle pieces fell into place. It wasn't just the government or the aliens they had to worry about. It was the shadows in the background, the hidden factions that had controlled everything from the beginning. A meeting was set, one that would finally reveal the truth behind the global conspiracy. But as the protagonist arrived at the secret location, they found themselves face to face with someone they never expected. A former mentor, someone who had shaped their worldview. "I had no choice," the mentor said, eyes cold and distant. "We did what was necessary for the survival of humanity." The words hit like a punch. The mentor was another cog in the machine, a puppet of the same forces that had orchestrated the alien plot. The lines between right and wrong blurred. How far had the conspiracy run? Was there anyone left who hadn't been compromised? The protagonist could feel the walls closing in. Every person they had once trusted seemed to be a part of the larger conspiracy, a pawn in the game that spanned decades. As the pieces fell into place, the depth of the government's involvement with the aliens became undeniable. It wasn't just manipulation. They had actively collaborated with the invaders, allowing them to infiltrate Earth's systems. But the protagonist's sense of loss ran deeper. They had been part of this system, unknowingly complicit in the very lies they were now uncovering. The revelation was more than just a political conspiracy, it was personal. The enemy wasn't just a shadowy force out there in the world, it was within them too. The struggle now was not just about survival, it was about facing the darkest parts of themselves and knowing that no one could be trusted. The truth had always seemed so distant, an abstract concept that could be pushed aside. But now, it was inescapable. As the protagonists pieced together more fragments of the alien conspiracy, they stumbled upon something far more personal. The truth about their family's legacy. They were not just bystanders in this war, they had been chosen long before the invasion began. Their bloodline, as it turned out, was tied to the aliens in ways they had never imagined. The revelation came through old family documents, hidden away in a forgotten box in the attic. An ancient connection to the extraterrestrial forces was buried within their ancestry. This wasn't a mere coincidence. It was a purpose. Their family had been involved in shaping humanity's path toward the aliens, even if they had never known it. The burden of this discovery was overwhelming, and the protagonist realized they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were part of the war, whether they liked it or not. As the protagonist dug deeper into their family's past, they found that their bloodline was not only connected to the aliens, but also to the very factions that had orchestrated the collaboration with the invaders. It wasn't a simple heritage, it was a legacy of manipulation, one that spanned generations. The protagonist's ancestors had been part of secret organizations that had worked with the extraterrestrials long before the invasion. They had been pawns in a much larger game. The protagonist was left to wrestle with this truth, torn between the guilt of their family's role in the conspiracy and the desperate need to right the wrongs of the past. This wasn't just a fight for the future of humanity, it was a battle for the soul of their family. The legacy of deceit weighed heavily on them. Could they overcome their ancestry, or was it too ingrained in their blood to escape? The more the protagonist uncovered, the more they understood the scale of the manipulation. The aliens hadn't just arrived, they had been shaping human history from the shadows for centuries. The protagonist's family had been instrumental in ensuring that humanity would one day be ready for the invasion. But there was more to this story than betrayal and secrets. The aliens, it seemed, had a much larger purpose, one that wasn't about conquest or domination. It was about survival, not just for them, but for the human race as well. The protagonist discovered that the alien presence on Earth wasn't just a threat. It was part of a plan to save humanity from an even greater disaster. As twisted as it was, the alien invasion was part of a larger plan of survival. The question was, could humanity accept the truth? Or would they reject the alien influence, dooming themselves in the process? The protagonist's world continued to crumble as they realized that their family's legacy wasn't just about manipulation. It was about a deep, intricate connection to the aliens' plan. It was a truth that shattered their understanding of the universe. They weren't merely pawns. They were key players in an intergalactic survival strategy. The weight of the discovery was unbearable. The protagonist confronted a family member who had known the truth all along. "You were never meant to be just a bystander," the family member said, their voice cold and detached. "You were always part of this." The truth hit like a freight train. The protagonist had been groomed for this moment from birth, tied to the fate of both humanity and the aliens. This was no longer a choice, it was a destiny. And now the protagonist had to decide, would they continue to play the role they were born into, or would they fight against it? The protagonist stood at the crossroads of their destiny, facing a choice that would shape the future of both humanity and the alien invaders. The truth was clear. They had been groomed for this. Their bloodline, their family, had been part of the grand design for centuries. They had never been free from the alien influence. But now, standing on the edge of it all, the protagonist had a decision to make. Would they embrace their legacy, accept the aliens' plan for survival, or would they resist it, fighting for humanity's independence, even at the cost of their own life? The weight of the decision was unbearable, but there was no turning back. The protagonist couldn't remain in the shadows any longer. They had to act, knowing that whatever path they chose would determine the fate of not just their world, but the very fabric of the universe itself. The decision loomed before the protagonist like an insurmountable mountain. Every path seemed fraught with peril, but the weight of the truth pressed harder with each passing moment. The alien forces were closing in. Humanity had no time left. The government, now exposed for its role in the conspiracy, scrambled to consolidate power, trying desperately to manage the invasion. But it was too late. The world was already divided. Trust was shattered, and the lines between ally and enemy had become blurred. In the midst of all this, the protagonist had been offered a choice. They could use the alien technology to fight back, to gain the power to stand against the invaders, but at what cost? Would they lose themselves in the process? Or should they expose the truth to the world, knowing that doing so might fracture humanity even further? The choice was theirs, but no matter what, the consequences would be irreversible. The protagonist's mind raced as they thought about the cost of using the alien technology. It could give them the power to strike back, to push the invaders back from Earth's doorstep. But they had seen the cost of such power before. They had witnessed the transformation of others who had come too close to the alien forces, people who had begun to lose their humanity in the pursuit of victory. The power was intoxicating, yes, but it came at a price that they were not sure they could pay. The idea of using alien technology to fight felt wrong, yet the alternative, allowing humanity to be subjugated, was unthinkable. With every passing second, the weight of the decision grew heavier. Could they risk losing their soul to save humanity, or would they choose to expose the truth and face the unknown consequences of that path? The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of an unexpected ally, a former friend who had been at their side from the beginning. The ally, a once optimistic military officer, was now hardened by the brutal reality of the invasion. "I know what you're thinking," they said, their voice steady, but tinged with fear. "But you have to understand we don't have time. The aliens are too powerful. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." The protagonist's heart sank as they listened. They had always believed in the idea of fighting for a free humanity, but now they saw the desperation in their friend's eyes. The threat was real, and time was running out. There was no more room for hesitation. And now, the decision was no longer about morality, it was about survival. And survival meant making hard choices. "What if this is the only way?" the protagonist whispered, their voice barely audible, as the weight of their next move pressed on their chest. The protagonist finally made their choice. It was time to expose the truth. The world had been manipulated for too long, and humanity deserved to know the real story. The alien forces had played their part, but the greater threat had always been the hidden factions within their own species. As the protagonists prepared to make the truth public, they realized the consequences would be far-reaching. It wouldn't just be the aliens they would have to fight. It would be the very people they had trusted, the systems that had been put in place to control them. The truth was dangerous, and those in power would stop at nothing to silence them. But, no matter the cost, the protagonist knew that this was the only way forward. Humanity needed to know what had been done to them, and it was up to the protagonist to ensure that the truth was heard. The war for Earth had just begun, and the battle for humanity's freedom was about to escalate. As the truth spread across the world, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Riots erupted in cities, governments scrambled to maintain control, and factions began to splinter. The protagonist watched as the world they had known descended into chaos. It was the cost of truth. Reality had been shattered, and there was no going back. But the protagonist also saw something else. Amidst the turmoil, there were signs of hope. People were waking up. They were no longer content to live in the shadow of manipulation. The alien invasion was no longer the sole threat. Now, humanity had to face the fact that they had been complicit in their own subjugation. The fight for freedom had just begun, and the protagonist knew that the road ahead would be long and dangerous. But at least now, humanity had a chance. The truth had been exposed, and in that there was power. The world had been thrown into chaos, and humanity's fight for survival had begun in earnest. The protagonist stood in the heart of the battlefield, the ground shaking beneath their feet as the alien forces advanced. It was clear now, this wasn't just an invasion. It was an extinction-level event, and Earth was on the brink. But the protagonist wasn't the same person they had been at the beginning. They had changed. The weight of the truth had forged them into something stronger, something unyielding. They had chosen their path, and now there was no turning back. Armed with alien technology and human determination, they led the charge against the invaders, rallying survivors into a united front. But as the battle raged around them, the protagonist felt the gnawing fear in their chest. The odds were stacked against them, and the cost of failure was unimaginable. But they couldn't afford to lose. Not now, not after everything they had learned. The battle intensified as the alien forces unleashed their full power, their weapons slicing through the air with precision and deadly intent. The protagonist's team moved swiftly, coordinating their attacks with the alien technology they had acquired. But as the protagonist watched the onslaught unfold, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The aliens were too advanced, too powerful. It was as if they were toying with humanity, letting them feel the illusion of victory before crushing them completely. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the protagonist caught sight of something that made their blood run cold. A fleet of massive alien ships hovering over the horizon, signaling the true scale of the invasion. This wasn't just a battle for Earth. It was a war for the very future of the human race. The protagonist gritted their teeth, steeling themselves for what was to come. There was no choice but to push forward. Amidst the chaos, the protagonist's resolve began to crack. Every corner of the city seemed to be under siege, and there was no place left to run. The alien forces were relentless, and humanity was struggling to keep up. The protagonist's team had fought valiantly, but they were running low on resources, and the alien army seemed to be endlessly replenishing. In the thick of battle, the protagonist realized something horrifying. The alien forces weren't just invaders, they were a part of a much larger, more complex plan. The aliens had been preparing for this invasion for centuries, systematically infiltrating Earth's systems and manipulating the planet's resources. The alien war was more than just an attempt to conquer Earth. It was about ensuring humanity's compliance in a galactic struggle for survival. The protagonist faced the undeniable truth. The aliens weren't here to destroy, they were here to control. And the war for Earth was only the beginning of something far larger. As the battle raged on, the protagonist came to a chilling conclusion. The only way to survive was to take the fight to the heart of the alien invasion. They couldn't wait for help. There would be no reinforcements. The war had to be won on their terms, and that meant taking a direct stand. The protagonist gathered their team, rallying them to face the final push. It was an all-or-nothing mission: infiltrate the alien mothership, destroy the core, and cut off the invaders' power. It was the only chance they had, and the risks were astronomical. But there was no time to second-guess. The protagonist had already lost so much: family, friends, humanity's trust. And now, the only thing left was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to save the world. It would be a suicide mission for most, but for the protagonist, it was the only path forward. The countdown to the final confrontation had begun. The final assault on the alien mothership was nothing short of catastrophic. The protagonist and their team fought their way through the labyrinthine corridors of the ship, dodging deadly alien drones and navigating the twisted architecture of the invaders' technology. Every step forward felt like a victory, but the cost was high. Soldiers fell, one by one, their sacrifice marking the path for the protagonist's journey toward the heart of the enemy's ship. When they finally reached the core, the air was thick with tension, and the protagonist knew this would be the moment that would determine humanity's fate. With no time left, they activated the alien device that would disable the mothership. But just as the countdown reached its final seconds, the protagonist's mind raced. Was this really the solution? Would the destruction of the mothership lead to humanity's freedom, or would it bring about an even greater disaster? They had no choice but to trust in their actions, knowing that once the button was pressed, everything would change forever. The protagonist stood amidst the rubble, the wreckage of the alien mothership, now a smoldering ruin. The last of the alien forces had retreated, but the war had left its scars. The world was in pieces, broken, scarred, but alive. Humanity had survived the invasion, but the cost was immense. Cities lay in ruin, governments crumbled, and the very fabric of civilization had been torn apart. The truth was now public knowledge, and humanity had been forced to confront the lies they had lived under for generations. There were no easy answers, no clear way forward. People were lost in the aftermath, caught between the overwhelming urge to rebuild and the weight of the knowledge that their world had been manipulated from within. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that the end of the war had only marked the beginning of an even greater struggle. This was no longer just about survival. It was about redemption, about facing the consequences of what had been done, and finding a way forward amidst the wreckage. The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by the gathering of survivors, people emerging from hiding, unsure whether to celebrate or mourn. It was a strange kind of victory, a victory tainted by the heavy price of truth and loss. Amidst the shattered buildings and scorched earth, the protagonist found themselves speaking to the people, a rallying cry for a fractured humanity. "We've seen the darkness," they said, their voice strong but filled with the weight of experience. "But now, we have to rebuild. We have to be better than what we were. We have to make sure this never happens again." The crowd responded, some with hope, others with doubt. But the words were enough to stir something in them, a spark, a flicker of unity in a world that had been divided. There was a long road ahead, and it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since the invasion, there was a glimmer of something resembling hope. As the weeks passed, the full scope of the alien invasion's aftermath became clear. The alien technology that had once seemed like a weapon of hope now became a double-edged sword. Some wanted to use it to rebuild, to protect humanity from future threats, but others saw it as a dangerous reminder of the past, a constant threat to their freedom. The protagonist knew that no matter what they decided, the scars of the invasion would remain. Some factions wanted to control the alien technology, while others feared it would enslave humanity all over again. The protagonist felt the weight of the decision pressing on them. They had fought for freedom, but now they had to make sure that freedom didn't become another form of control. It was a delicate balance. Could they unite humanity under a common cause, or would the temptation of power tear them apart once again? The protagonist realized that the decision had to be made, and it could no longer be delayed. It was time to face the consequences of the truth. The government had been shattered, but the systems of control that had allowed it to thrive still lingered in the minds of those in power. Some still sought to maintain their hold on the remnants of authority. Others, like the protagonist, believed in a new way forward, one built on transparency and trust. It was a vision of humanity that was free of the lies and manipulations that had shaped their past. The protagonist knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, both from within and outside, but they couldn't allow humanity to return to the way things were. They had to act now, to ensure that the future would belong to those who truly believed in freedom and unity. The weight of leadership was crushing, but the protagonist understood that they had no choice. The time for rebuilding had come. The decision was made, and the future of humanity was now in the hands of those who would rebuild. The protagonist stood before a newly formed council, composed of representatives from all corners of the world. It was a fragile alliance, one forged out of necessity rather than trust. But for the first time in a long while, there was a shared sense of purpose. The alien forces were gone, but the true battle, one for humanity's future, was just beginning. The protagonist spoke to the council, their words resonating with both fear and hope. "This is our chance," they said. "We can either rebuild from the ashes or let the mistakes of the past control our future. The choice is ours." As they finished speaking, the room fell into a heavy silence. The decisions made in the coming days would determine whether humanity would rise from the ruins or fall into the same traps that had nearly destroyed them. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time humanity had a chance to choose their destiny. As the dust settled and humanity began to rebuild, the protagonist found themselves alone in a world forever changed. The truth had been exposed, and while some began to hope, others still struggled to accept what had happened. The protagonist stood in a quiet park, staring at the ruins of what was once a bustling city center. The sky above was clear, but the world felt heavy, as if something was still lingering just out of sight. "This isn't over," the protagonist whispered to themselves, the words barely escaping their lips. Though the immediate threat of the alien forces had been neutralized, they knew the true war was only just beginning. The revelations of the past, the betrayals and the scars left by the invasion, would not be so easily erased. Humanity had come to terms with the reality that they were no longer alone in the universe, but the consequences of that knowledge were still unfolding. The fight for the future had only begun. The weeks following the alien retreat had been a blur for the protagonist. Though the war had ended, the truth about the world, humanity's role, and the nature of the aliens' involvement had left its scars. There were whispers of alien technology being used to control the masses, of factions that sought to rise from the ashes of the old world, and others who wanted to bring the alien knowledge to the forefront. The protagonist knew that they had to remain vigilant. The battle for humanity's future wasn't just about surviving the invasion, it was about preventing the mistakes of the past from being repeated. "We have to stay united," the protagonist said during a private meeting with the council, their voice resolute but tinged with a quiet sorrow. "If we don't, we risk falling into the same traps that led us to this point." But even as the words left their lips, doubt began to settle in. Could humanity truly avoid the mistakes of its past? The protagonist's mind was racing as they prepared for the next phase of the journey. The council had agreed to a new path forward, one where the alien technology would be used cautiously and with oversight. It was a fragile compromise. Trust had been shattered, and there were many who believed that any use of alien power would lead to humanity's eventual downfall. Yet, the protagonist knew that they could not let fear control their decisions. The alien technology could be a force for good, but only if humanity learned from the mistakes of the past. The protagonist's own legacy was intertwined with the future of this new world, and they couldn't shake the weight of the responsibility. "We must be stronger than the fear that binds us," the protagonist said during a gathering of world leaders. "Our future is not in the past, but in the choices we make today." But would those words be enough to inspire the world to change, or would they be drowned out by the remnants of a broken system? The protagonist returned to the ruins of their childhood home, a place they had once found comfort and solace. Now it stood as a symbol of everything that had been lost, both personally and globally. The world had been reshaped by the invasion and the truth that followed, but some parts of the past remained. The protagonist walked through the empty halls, remembering a time before the chaos, when their biggest concern was something far less monumental. The invasion had stolen that simplicity, replacing it with a deeper understanding of the fragility of existence. As they stood by an old family portrait, they couldn't help but wonder if humanity could ever reclaim that innocence. Would the new world be one of constant vigilance and fear? Or could humanity rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually? The protagonist touched the portrait, their fingers brushing against the faces of those long gone. The truth was painful, but it had brought clarity. They could only hope that the future they were fighting for would be worth the sacrifices made. The world was finally starting to rebuild. The protagonist watched as a new generation began to rise, shaped by the lessons of the past and the uncertainty of the future. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, humanity seemed to be moving towards something greater. The alien presence had left its mark on Earth, but it had also opened the eyes of humanity to the possibilities of the universe beyond their planet. Yet, as the protagonist gazed out at the horizon, they couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. The future was still unknown, and the scars of the past would never fully heal. But perhaps that was the way forward, understanding the mistakes, the victories, and the pain, and using that knowledge to chart a new course. "This isn't the end," the protagonist said softly, as they looked toward the distant skyline. "It's only the beginning." The world had changed, but so had the protagonist. And now, it was time to step into that unknown future.